A brief beginning. Bells rang out in alarm, and blades flashed beneath the high dome. Blood mixed with wax. People rushed to the doors, and the city held its breath. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Tell me where you're watching this video from in the comments. It's important for me to know how you found our stories. I hope you enjoy listening. Florence greeted the dawn with the smell of wet stone and warm bread. In a copyist's shop on the narrow street of Santa Maria del Fiore, a young man named Lauro sharpened his pen and crumbled dried crumbs between his fingers to remove excess ink. His uncle, Master Armano, kept books of merchants' accounts, priests' notes, and nobles' promissory notes in a cabinet behind a curtain. Every dawn here was the same: orders for bookbinding, cautious requests to copy letters, rare secret notes with hints of matters usually discussed in the shadows. Lauro was considered an apprentice, but he had a gift he didn't like to talk about. He could quickly see how someone else's handwriting was structured, guess omissions, and catch hidden meanings in the text. He often felt that the letters were arguing with each other, and this argument left a noticeable trace. In those days, the city lived to two rhythms. One was visible to all: markets, tax collection, endless conversations at the wells. The other could be felt beneath the surface. The names of famous bankers were heard in every house, and at the tables, people argued about Lorenzo de' Medici's generosity, his celebrations, and his patronage of artists and musicians. Not everyone was happy. In narrow courtyards, some whispered that the family's power was too easy on the surface and had become too heavy in reality. Lauro, copying another order, noticed a line that had not been ordered. There was an extra word in the usual prayer, invisible to the eye, but strangely hanging with meaning. He marked it with a small dot. He reread it again. In the words about mercy and forgiveness, a number was suddenly hidden, which made no sense in the set of letters, but was a sign for those who knew. This word coincided with a mark he had already encountered in winter on another piece of paper, where a customer had asked him to rewrite an innocent message to his sister. Then, the extra mark was in the word about health. Now, it was between the lines in the prayer. He had encountered the same faint mark 3 times. He told his uncle that he had noticed something strange. His uncle replied that the young man was looking too much at the letters and too little at the customers, and that this was giving rise to empty fears in his head. Lauro nodded, but inside he was not reassured. A girl named Marcella lived in the same neighborhood. She took care of her sick mother and helped out in the bellmaker's shop. She was considered modest and inconspicuous, but she had a hidden skill. She could interpret bells as musical notes. When a single strike sounded, she knew who had pulled the rope and what state that person's heart was in. It seemed to her that the city spoke in strikes, and if you listened carefully, you could hear more than you were allowed to. Her neighbors laughed, called her strange and underappreciated, and said she was only good for counting the chimes. But she didn't argue, silently polishing the brass, lubricating the axle, and checking the bell clapper to ensure the sound was clear. On the eve of a big holiday, it was announced to the public in the cathedral that the Medici brothers would be attending the service. The city came alive. Butchers discussed which cut of meat would be best for the feast. Craftsmen cleaned their shirts so they would look as good as their neighbors when they came to the cathedral. Lauro brought new parchment and began binding the prayer book in the morning. He noticed a tiny letter in the margins, written differently from the master who usually wrote for the cathedral. The letter resembled a key, like those used to mark secret places in accounts. Below it was the date, April 26, 1478, written with such precision that it seemed as if the writer had kept his hand on cold steel and did not allow himself to tremble. The day dragged on. A courier came to the shop. He brought a package in rough canvas and asked if Master Armano was there. The courier said he had been sent from the house of a noble patron. and the package contained a list of donations for candles. Armano was distracted and instructed Lauro to accept the package and sign for it. The young man felt his stomach tighten. He remembered the extra mark in the prayer lines. He carefully opened the canvas and saw not only a list of names inside, but also a small bundle of wax seals, tightly glued between two layers of fabric. There was too much wax for simple seals. He carefully pressed the edge with his fingernail, and a narrow knife slipped out of the wax, as if designed to open envelopes. Two intertwined leaves were carved on the handle. Lauro froze. He knew this sign. Last year, there had been one just like it on the string that tied the purse in the house where he had brought the debt lists. He remembered the surname that was spoken either loudly or in whispers in the city. Inside, everything fell into place. The young man took the package to his uncle. His uncle told him to return the package to the courier and not to open it again, saying that any explanations would bring trouble, that clever attentiveness was sometimes more dangerous than stupidity. But Lauro had already made up his mind. He thought that either he was wrong and would apologize, or he was right, and then delay would be a crime. He took the sheet with the extra marks to the bell ringer's house, where the senior assistant to the city gong often stayed. There, he found Marcella. He told her what he had noticed. The girl listened. She said that in the morning, the tongue of the big bell did not sound like metal, but like dry wood, as happens when someone presses a rope against a pole so that the strike sounds at a different moment. This could mean a prepared false signal. They exchanged glances. A trivial detail, a bundle of wax and steel, extra lines in the letters, a weakened rope. All of this together smelled of trouble. They brought the sheets to the house of the senior scribe at the cathedral, a dry and strict man. He listened, said that young people tend to see conspiracies where there is simple carelessness, but just in case, he would warn an acquaintance from among the people close to the Medici family. He told them to remain calm and not spread rumors, and sent the boy away with a note. The boy ran across the courtyard and disappeared. Marcella, returning to the ropes, noticed two men in dark cloaks in the alley. They looked like merchants. One had his hand on his ribs, as if he had a bandage under his clothes that he was not used to. This proved nothing, but the girl remembered it. The day of the service arrived. The cathedral breathed with human shoulders. The candles burned with an even flame. The bells rang calmly, as they always did before an important event. In the main square, people formed a slow stream. The cathedral was crowded, but not stuffy. The city practiced the habit of standing close and looking at those who had come to be seen. The brothers from the Medici family were the center of attention. Someone noted that the younger of the two had arrived later than usual. Someone said he looked tired. It all sounded like the usual words before a big prayer. The first blow came when people looked up at the sound of Latin words. A short flash of metal flashed under the dome. At first, no one understood what had happened. Then it became clear that one of the brothers was holding his side, and blood was dripping onto the marble. Another pressed his hand to his neck and began to move toward the side door. Some people decided that he had fallen because of the stuffiness. Others saw the faces of people they had long hated. The festive day turned into a tense moment where it was not the throat that screamed, but the heart. The bells were supposed to call for calm, but instead they rang out in discord. Someone pulled the rope at the wrong moment. The people realized that it was not just a holiday in the city. A murmur rose under the dome. Those who had come with knives began to push their way to the exit. In the square, people remembered old grudges, weighed their new fears, and chose sides. Marcella rushed to the rope and pulled it so that the sound was high and long. It was a signal known in the city as an alarm, requiring everyone to gather at the palace for a council meeting. Dust from the rope fell on her hands. The girl paid no attention. Lauro, standing at the door, tried to hold back the attackers. He noticed one of the merchants in a dark cloak. He was clutching a hilt with 2 blades on it. Lauro realized that his guess had been right. The young man grabbed his opponent's arm, not knowing how to fight gracefully, but only as those who carried heavy stacks of books were taught to do. They fell down. The knife struck the stone, flew off, and disappeared behind the people's feet. The man jerked and darted toward the side passage. Lauro did not have time to catch up, but he remembered how the man moved the side door latch, as if he knew in advance how it worked. In the crowd loomed a man dressed as a modest merchant from Pisa. He was not a Florentine. His name was Ruggiero, and he had come to the city for fabrics. He was received coldly and kept at a distance, but Ruggiero had a strange habit. He kept track of time not by an hourglass, but by the tolling of the bell, and his memory linked the rhythm of the city with the rhythm of trade deals. He had noticed that in the morning the bell had tolled an extra time between 2 regular tolls. This was no coincidence. When the commotion began, he rushed to the guard at the palace and said that the stables were already prepared on one of the side streets, waiting for people who would leave the cathedral through the side doors. The guard did not argue. He had enough shouting around him. He sent 2 young guards to the indicated place. They arrived a minute before the 3 fugitives broke out. The first was knocked down, the second was pinned against the wall, and the third pushed the child away and went straight for the sword. He was caught. Ruggiero's action was an unexpected intervention. He had no friends or patrons here. He was little respected. His name meant nothing. But at that moment, it was his observation and decisiveness that changed the course of events in one courtyard. In the evening, people in the city recounted how a foreign merchant had shown the guards the way. Those who had previously treated him with cold politeness suddenly became fewer. He was offered bread and water, and at the market, people gave way to him. Then, the city became a city of alarm. The news that one brother was wounded and the other was injured and fleeing spread through the streets faster than a man could run. People began to gather at the palace. The bells stopped ringing out of tune. Marcellina made them ring as they should, and their voice sounded steady and firm. The senior scribe at the cathedral brought a notebook with an illusion of calm on his face and handed it to a man close to the court. He remembered the pages Lauro had shown him, and now he saw that the letters were not the play of a young mind. The book contained marks that coincided with the time of the service and the places where the noise was to rise. An ordinary day that began with a simple delivery became an act of intense suspense. Everyday life turned into a threat. Everything that had seemed trivial before now fell into place. The bell rope, the knife in the wax, the mark in the word of mercy, the stranger merchant, the outside gaze at the side door. All of this came together in a pattern. People from a family that considered itself equal to any authority were now hiding and running through the alleys where they had always walked proudly. In the middle of the day, several suspects were arrested near the palace. Among them was a man known in the city under a false name. His face reminded Marcella of a childhood neighbor who had disappeared many years ago after a fight at the mill. Later, when he was questioned, it turned out that he was indeed the one who had once saved her from an angry dog, but then fled the city after getting involved in a bloody affair. He had now returned to become part of someone else's plan. It was a family ring that no one knew about. He was a distant relative of Marcella's on her mother's side. The connection had been hidden, and now it had resurfaced after all these years, like a heavy object from the bottom of the sea. The girl experienced it strangely, not as a sensation, but as a quiet blow to the chest. A childhood incident, a kind deed, long years of silence, and now this man was on the other side. The hidden kinship weighed heavily on her choice. By evening, it became clear that the city had not split in two. In the shops, where there was always debate, this time the debate was shorter. People said they did not like autocracy, but they hated the slaughter in a holy place. They did not like high bills, but they liked daggers under the dome even less. Crowds began to gather at the palace. Several conspirators tried to raise a cry and call for a coup, but their words sounded hollow against the backdrop of the morning's bloodshed. The night brought dampness and the heavy smell of fuses. People whose faces had been next to knives during the day were dragged through the city. Some managed to escape, but not all. Torches were lit on the palace wall. The tolling of the bell became rare and heavy. The city was experiencing not just a disaster, but a turning point. What had been a quiet dispute in the shops became a conscious choice. The House of Medici gathered supporters, and among them were not only the nobility, but also those who were not usually invited to councils. Craftsmen, musicians, bakers, copyists, and bell ringers came. Their faces wore a stubborn look, devoid of pride but full of clarity. Lauro returned to his shop and opened the very same package in the canvas. Inside, besides the knife, there were 2 notes. One was written with a light hand, like that of a person accustomed to noble correspondence. The other was written in a hasty hand. The first note spoke of the next step, that the morning after the service, they must ensure that the town began talking about a fair trial for the people from the house, who had become a nuisance to everyone. The second note was addressed to the jewelers and described the sign by which the executors would recognize each other. Lauro felt an unpleasant dryness. He realized that now he had not just suspicions, but direct evidence. He brought them to the senior scribe, who passed them on to the people at the palace. This became a thread that, when pulled, revealed the fabric. Meanwhile, Marcella followed the ropes to make sure no one could tamper with the signal. She climbed the bell tower before dawn and checked the knots. On the upper platform, she met a gray-haired guard. He told her that he remembered her from childhood, when she was brought here by the hand. He said that once a young man saved a girl's life at the mill and then disappeared. He said that at the time, people talked about the boy as a rascal, but on that day, he was a hero. The girl realized that he was talking about the very man who had been brought here yesterday with his hands tied. The hidden kinship stung again. The girl did not condone the villainy, but she felt a pang of pain at how one choice in youth can lead to another in adulthood. At dawn on April 27, 1478, 2 pillars entwined with ropes were erected in the square in front of the palace. The city was not inclined towards slow processes. It preferred quick resolutions. But before tying the ropes, the people at the palace did something that those who came with knives did not expect. They began to read aloud the notes brought from the scribe's shop and say that those who planned the massacre in the holy place had thereby cut off their path to mercy. The words sounded dry, without embellishment. The crowd whispered that this was not revenge, but a response to fear. People saw not only blood on the marble, but also cold calculation in the notes. A musician nicknamed the violinist, who was considered an empty person who easily spread rumors, was asked to play alarming marches. He waved his hand, and people were surprised. He not only knew how to play, but he had such a keen ear that he could direct the crowd to the council building without shouting. Before that, he had been underestimated, considered a laughingstock, but today he became the one who kept the rhythm of the city. His violin sounded smooth and taciturn. People followed the music as they would follow clear instructions. The underestimated became a pillar of support, and for the first time that day, the crowd moved in an orderly fashion. On the same day, something happened that finally shifted the conversation from status to skill. In the palace courtyard, a dispute broke out between a noble cavalier and a simple locksmith. The side passages had to be reinforced to prevent the conspirators from freeing their comrades. The cavalier believed it was better to put more people there. The craftsman said that the position of the bolts needed to be changed and an additional spike needed to be cut in, Then 3 people would replace 10. Previously, no one had listened to him. But now there was no time. The craftsman quickly cut a groove, hammered in the spike, and checked the movement. When, an hour later, a group of people banged on the doors, persistently trying to remove the bolts, the modified design held. The people outside the door lost precious minutes, and the guards managed to surround them. The crowd saw how the craftsman changed the outcome of the battle with a single decision. Fate recognized skill as more important than title. It was a clear turning point when hidden talent versus status became the rule for the day. At noon, a man in rich clothing arrived at the palace, whom no one was expecting. He was a mentor from the house who usually stayed out of political games. He brought with him a dozen armed men and a bag full of coins. He told those organizing the defense that he would cover today's expenses for security, bread for the crowd, and oil for the torches. He ordered his men to stand where the passages were narrowest. His intervention was an unexpected blessing. When asked why he was doing this, he replied through his assistant that when blood is shed in a holy place, disputes over trade privileges must be put aside, because without peace, there can be no trade. His action sent a clear message. Not all rich people think only of their own interests. This intervention influenced the mood of the crowd, the confidence of the guards, and the fact that the city sided with those who rejected slaughter as a means of resolution. By the evening of the second day, Loro was as strong as he was tired. He realized that by signing each neat letter, he had taken responsibility not only for the text, but also for its meaning. He brought another parchment. It contained a list of those who had come to the shop in recent weeks and asked to have innocent texts with unnecessary marks rewritten. Their names matched those of the detainees. The scribe at the palace smiled for the first time that day. He said that sometimes the fate of a city depends on whether a student sees an extra line in a word. Marcella stood by the bells and held the rope as if she were holding a ship in the harbor in a strong current. Her hands hurt, but she did not let go. It seemed to her that all the blows combined into one big voice, saying that the city had chosen order. The girl knew that inside her there was pain for a relative who had ended up on the other side. She decided to do what seemed to her to be the only thing possible. She went to one of the palace advisors and asked him to let her tell him who one of the detainees was and how he had once saved her life. She said that this was not an excuse, but a request that the court's decision be a firm one, not cold revenge. The advisor listened and said that he would take this detail into account when passing sentence. He ordered her words to be recorded, so the hidden connection didn't change the outcome, but it did change the tone of the sentence. Instead of instant punishment, one of the guys got jail time and exile instead of the noose. It seemed like a small win on a big day, but it's these little decisions that make the difference between blind rage and responsible authority. The city lived through another night. On the morning of the third day, a messenger from a house close to the palace appeared at the bellmaker's shop. He brought a small purse and a letter. The letter said that the house was grateful to the bell workshop for the accuracy of the signal in the most difficult hours. The purse was modest, but it was enough to replace the worn ropes and buy oil for the axle. The people in the shop smiled. That day, Marcella was asked for the first time to show how she tuned the strike, and they listened without smirking. The underappreciated woman had become a master, and this was recognized not by words, but by a request for her services. Ruggero, a merchant from Pisa, was about to leave. His journey continued on to Lucca. In the square, a member of the city guard approached him and handed him a short note from the counselor. The note said that the stranger had helped the city in a difficult moment, and that his name would be mentioned in a positive light when the events were reviewed. He was offered protection to the outpost. Yesterday's stranger left not as an outcast, but as a guest who was seen off with respect. The unexpected benefactor became one of their own for a single day, and that was enough for the city to remember one simple conclusion: honor sometimes comes not from blood, but from choice. In those days, the houses of those who had planned the massacre were torn down. Their property was appraised, their names recorded in books. Some of them tried to beg for mercy, citing their past services to the city. But in response, they were told that service does not erase blood on marble. Firm clarity replaced noisy speeches. Guards stood on the bridges. Torches burned on the corners. The bells finally fell silent. The city, which had survived the blow in the cathedral, chose the side of the Medici family not out of love for holidays, but out of simple arithmetic. A knife in a temple is more expensive than any offense. For Lauro, this story ended on the day when a man in neat dark clothes entered his shop and placed a new order on the table. It was an order for a book that had to describe the events of 3 days accurately and without embellishment. The man said that the house close to the palace wanted the story to be recorded dryly, without unnecessary words, so that those who came later would know what had decided the outcome and what had become a lesson. He said that the names of those who had distinguished themselves would be included in the book. Among the names were those of Laura, Marcella, Ruggiero, and the locksmith. Opposite each name, there should be not praise, but action. Who did what, at what time, and what it led to. It was a new form of memory for the city, not loud, but businesslike. The young man realized that his gift of seeing the extra line had become part of the common work, like a pin in a door, like a rope on a bell, like a note delivered to the right address at the right time. Marcella climbed the bell tower again that same day. She stood looking at the city and thought that sound could be not only an alarm, but also peace. She understood that kinship did not justify the knife, but it could remind one of the human being in the criminal and of the measure of punishment. She knew that people now looked at her differently, not because of the miraculous story, but because she had done her job accurately at the right moment. The city returned to its daily routine. In the markets, people were once again arguing about the price of fish and the quality of fabric. But the arguments had become a little quieter. In the evenings, the violinist's violin could be heard near the palace, no longer alarming, but steady, like the prick of a needle in fabric when a seamstress makes her last stitch. He had been underestimated before, but now people nodded when he passed by. The locksmith received 2 new orders from wealthy houses that had not noticed him before. The merchant from Pisa left, and in letters to him, people wrote that if he ever found himself in Florence again, he had friends here. In the book that Laura was copying, the date was clear: April 26, 1478, the day when knives flashed under the dome and bells rang with a strange voice. The 27th was the day when the city chose sides. The 28th was when the punishment became clear and unrelenting. At the bottom of the book, a blank line was left for those who wanted to add their names to the list of witnesses. Lauro thought that the witnesses were not only those who saw the blood, but also those who heard the extra toll of the bell in time, noticed the dash in the word, reinforced the bolt, or took a step without expecting gratitude. The ending was not like a fairy tale. No one became great just because they wanted to. But everyone had a choice, and that choice led to a common outcome. The town understood that justice does not come by chance. It is gathered bit by bit, by the attentiveness of a young man, the accuracy of a blow, the skill of a craftsman, the decision of a stranger who became one of their own at the right moment, and even the pain of a girl who acknowledged her kinship without taking away the guilt. So a simple parcel in a canvas bag, the smell of wax, and the creak of a rope turned a melodrama into a sober drama with a clear moral resolution. The bells rang evenly again, and when their sound echoed through the stone streets, it spoke not of fear, but of a city that had found its voice and held on to it. After a few quiet days, the city began to breathe more deeply, but along with that, beneath that breath, echoes of deeds that still needed to be completed accumulated. The copyist's shop smelled of glue, leather, and warm ash, which Lauro sprinkled on the edges so that the glue would stick evenly. He thought not only about the book for the court, but also about the pattern of marks he had noticed in the innocent prayers, which was hardly the work of one or two people. He remembered the autumn when a modest cleric from a monastery on the outskirts came into the shop, asked for a litany to be copied, and requested a special type of decorated letter in every other phrase. At the time, Lauro shrugged and did as requested, but now he realized that this letter design could have been an early attempt at what had happened in the cathedral. He pulled an old notebook with samples out of the chest and found several pages with those very curls. He felt uneasy. He told his uncle that they needed to look through all the orders from the past year. His uncle replied that the young man's memory could be trusted and that it would be better to compile the records into a single coherent table. They did just that. They wrote down the names, dates, and where the strange way of decorating letters was noted and where it was not. The table was filled with neat rows, and it became clear from these rows that after winter the marks began to appear more frequently, reaching a peak 2 weeks before the service. In the afternoon, a jeweler known in the city as a master seal maker came to the shop. He said he had been summoned to the palace to sort out a matter involving several rings. He wanted to look at the bundle with the knife and wax that the whole neighborhood was already whispering about. The uncle shook his head, but showed the master what was not related to the secret. The jeweler looked at the impressions on the paper and said that the shape of the seals was strange. It was as if they had been made not on the usual gold matrix, but on a softer metal, similar to a copper alloy, so that in case of failure, they could be quickly remelted and destroyed. This was a sign of haste and fear. The jeweler added that one of the impressions suspiciously resembled an old seal of a pious brotherhood that had disbanded several years ago after a quarrel with the city council. He said that there was a broken matrix in the workshop that had been brought in for repair at that time, and that he had refused to repair it because of doubts about the customer. The jeweler agreed to take the matrix to the palace if asked in writing. That same day, he was walking alongside the guards, and his bundle of iron jingled like a small bell. A simple detail about the alloy completed the picture and showed that the preparations had been made with the intention of destroying all traces. Meanwhile, Marcella continued to tidy up the bells. She checked the knots, lubricated the axles, and taught the apprentice boy to hold the rope so that his hand would not slip. The boy's name was Pietro, and he was underestimated in the courtyard. He was considered flighty, slow at arithmetic, and only good for carrying buckets. These days he was quieter than usual, because he had seen Marcella crying at night after returning from the palace, where she had pleaded for one of the detainees. He wanted to help in some way, and said he had noticed something strange. Someone had replaced the lower knot with a thin cord that could be easily cut. He said this quietly, embarrassed, but Marcella understood that this was not a trifle, but an important observation. She asked him to find a piece of old rope in the workshop, show her how to tie the knot better, and repeated the entire suspension scheme with him. She saw that Pietro was precise, careful, and not lazy in this matter. By evening, he was already tying knots better than the senior assistant. The underestimated boy became part of the support team. Soon, the palace noticed that the ringing had become not only accurate, but also economical. The rope no longer wore out faster than usual. For the first time, Pietro heard from strangers that his work was producing results. The next morning, a man in a gray cloak approached the copyist's bench. He said he was coming from a monastery on the outskirts of town, where books for the city council had once been bound. He brought a narrow package containing an old notebook with examples of handwriting. The first page stated that the notebook was used to train young scribes. The pages smelled of wax and dampness. Lauro opened the notebook and saw familiar curls, which he had considered merely a decorative habit of an old master. Now he realized that these curls could be turned into symbols. Numbers were written in pencil in the margins of the notebook, and these numbers coincided with the city clock. It turned out that someone had long ago transformed the decoration of the letters into a cipher. Lauro told his uncle that it was too late to feel guilty, but that the notebook had to be taken to the palace so that those responsible could see the root of the problem. His uncle agreed. This move did not promise glory, but it allowed them to follow the thread to its beginning, rather than cutting it off halfway. During those same days, trouble came to Marcella's house. Her mother became more seriously ill than usual. The doctor who served their neighborhood said that they needed herbs that were not cheap to obtain in the city. Marcella realized that they didn't have enough money. She didn't go begging, but asked the senior scribe for temporary work. To sort through the lists, double-check the names and amounts of donations so that there would be no mistakes in the city's books. He agreed and promised to pay her fairly. The girl took on the job. Even though she was tired of the bells, she didn't complain. That same evening, a Jewish doctor, known in the city for his market, approached her in the shop. He rarely went on such calls to poor houses. He said he had heard about her nightly run between the bell tower and the palace, and that on days like these, the city should pay not only with gold. He offered her herbs from his bag and explained how to brew them. He refused money, asking only to be told in a week's time whether it had helped. This intervention was a simple and significant blessing. Marcella was not used to such things. She did not like to accept gifts, but she accepted because she knew the value of time. Her mother became easier to care for. People in the city quietly said that in difficult times, strangers' doors could also open without charge, and this detail was important for the general sense of proportion. In the evening at the palace, they decided what to do with those whose names appeared on the lists, but whose blood was not found on the marble. Some advisors demanded harshness. Others said that those who planned it and those who were drawn into it should be separated. The hall smelled of sealing wax and smoke. Lauro brought his table and said through a scribe that he could see the sequence of orders and distinguish deliberate marks from simple mistakes. He pointed to lines where it was clear that a young priest had first ordered prayers without extra marks, then with rare marks, and on the eve of the holiday with a dense network of marks. This meant that the man had become part of the game not by accident, but step by step. He asked not to put everyone on the same level. His request was heard. The next morning, several people were sent to monasteries for long terms without the right to leave rather than to the gallows. The crowd grumbled, some demanding equal punishment. But the advisors explained through the heralds that the city's strength lay not in treating everyone the same, but in distinguishing between different steps. This decision was not an easy one, but it was in line with the overall goal: to restore order and prevent the investigation from turning into a hunger riot. On the third day after these decisions, a simple woman in a dark cloak came to the copyist's shop. She placed a bundle on the table and said that her neighbor had given it to her, asking her to give it to the person who worked with the palace books. The woman left quickly without giving her name. The bundle contained a thin fabric case. Inside was a small wooden figurine soaked in something oily. At first glance, it looked like a child's toy, but when Lauro picked at the crack with his fingernail, a needle came out of the figurine's belly. It was a hidden poisoning device concealed in an innocent object. Next to it lay a strip of fabric with letters resembling domestic patterns. An everyday object turned out to be a threat. Lauro did not touch it further and called the guards. The guards arrived quickly, took the item carefully, wrapped it in thick leather, and carried it away. In the evening, The herald announced that this was no accident, that such items had already been found in cities where someone was trying to continue what had been started in the cathedral. This shook people more than the sight of torches. It turned out that danger could come in a bag of bread or in a note on a string. But with this, determination also grew. People began to pay more attention to small details: seals, knots, unexpected gifts. Suspense returned for one act, but now it was not panic, but discipline. Meanwhile, the jeweler provided the palace with the broken matrix of the Brotherhood and pointed out how it differed from the seals on the confiscated notes. He said that the new seals were made by apprentices, not masters, and that this was evident from the depth of the lines. This meant that among the conspirators was someone young who had access to the tool, but lacked real skill. The list of names narrowed. Among them was the son of a respected businessman who had previously made many donations to that very monastery. The father was honest, the son was hot-headed. The family came to the palace, and the father said through an intermediary that he was willing to cover the costs of community service if his son was given a chance to work in the brick workshops instead of in chains. He admitted his son's guilt and asked for a chance to make amends. The council agreed to a measure with restrictions. This decision showed the city that money cannot buy forgiveness, but it can be a tool for good deeds if the owner is willing to acknowledge the pain of others and his share of responsibility. In the summer, when the heat was oppressive and the marble of the cathedral retained its warmth until nightfall, Marcella climbed the bell tower with Pietro. She told him that she wanted to establish a new order. Instead of one person at the ropes, there would be two on key days, and the signals would be recorded in advance on a wax tablet. She taught him to mark each stroke with a short line so that they could check it later. Previously, this had been considered excessive, but now it had become the norm. Pietro wrote, his tongue sticking out from the effort, but his hand remained steady. At the foot of the bell tower stood a man in a cloak, looking up. He was from a house famous for its courts and disputes. He came to Marcella later and said he wanted to offer her a place at the city signal, and Pietro training with one of the masters. He added that the city rarely thanked people on time, but this time it did not want to be late. Marcella accepted not for the glory, but because she understood the responsibility. Pietro was beaming. Yesterday's boy was becoming an apprentice with a future. Meanwhile, Lauro found an old piece of paper in his chest that had been placed there in the winter. There were only a few words on the paper, and he associated them with a simple request for a binding. But now he read them differently. The words were arranged so that the first letters of each line spelled out the name of a person who later appeared on the list of organizers of an old brotherhood. It was an early clue. He felt how strange it was that he had overlooked it and understood the value of experience. He told his uncle that he would never again treat letters as empty figures. His uncle smiled for the first time in many days. He said that the city needed people who could see and were not afraid to report what they saw. The young man realized that he was choosing not a craft for the sake of bread, but a craft as part of the order. It was a quiet inner choice, which is often more important than loud words in the square. After a while, an open reading of the book of events that Lauro had been working on was held in the palace. They did it without pomp. The herald read out by day and hour who had done what blow had been struck, what letter had been delivered, where the master had been standing when the torch was brought, where a foreign merchant had shown the stables. The names were read in an even voice. No one was praised. No one was dragged through the mud beyond measure. When they reached the part about Marcella's family ties, the herald spoke cautiously, so as not to inflame the crowd. He did not hide the fact, but emphasized that it was precisely the acknowledgement of kinship and the request for leniency that changed the tone of the punishment. The people in the crowd nodded silently. For them, it was not empty equality, but a concrete decision that carried risk. This reading became a catharsis without loud statues. It straightened the shoulders of those who had done their part, and quietly made those who had been the loudest before, but had disappeared in the hour of need, lower their eyes. Weeks after the spring events, a wanderer returned to the city from the roads, whom many considered an empty storyteller and collector of rumors. His name was Fabio, and he used to earn his living by singing cheerful songs on street corners. People were used to his jokes and did not take him seriously. Now, he came to the guard at the bridge and said that on the way, he had overheard a conversation between two people who wanted to bring thin knives hidden in barrels of fish into the city. He named the spot by the river where the cargo was to be transferred to a cart. The guard did not believe him at first, but decided to check, because after the incident with the needle, the city had become more cautious. At dawn, the guards found the cart, the barrels, and in one of them, thin blades wrapped in fish scales. Fabio turned out to be a man of substance. In the square, they said that he had ceased to be a jester and had become someone who took risks and did not want to take money for informing on others. He was given a simple certificate, giving him the right to perform at fairs in the future without paying a fee. It was a small thing, but it showed respect. The underestimated man became a pillar of support again, and this was no accident, but a natural consequence of these months. In the fall, when the air became drier, a man from the same house who had previously brought coins for security came to Marcella. He said that the house would now take care of repairing the stairs to the bell tower and paying for new pulleys. He did not ask for an answer. He said that in difficult times, it is not walls that hold a city together, but people, and that people's work must be made easier. Marcella listened and thought about simple things: knots, lubrication, marked plates. She understood that convenient access to the bell tower was no more trivial than a spike in a door. Small things ensure order just as much as big decisions. She thanked him and asked the master to send wood without cracks. They brought it to her. The bell tower began to function more smoothly. At the end of the year, an old man in simple gray clothes appeared in the copyist's shop. He said that he had once taught young scribes to write decorative letters, not suspecting that someone would turn them into signs. He had heard that a man had died because of these letters and wanted to ask the city for forgiveness. He did not wait for an answer. He placed a thin ruler on the table, which he used to straighten the margins, and asked that the young people no longer decorate their prayers with unnecessary embellishments. Lauro did not blame him. He said through his uncle that it was not the letters that were the problem, but those who had given them a different meaning. The old man left, his gait light and weary. There was no pathos in this scene. It was a simple human knot, where guilt and innocence did not break over the knee, but lay side by side. In winter, when the city closed the shutters on the windows at night, another notebook was brought to the palace. It contained a letter from a man who used to sit in the workshop working on the seals. He wrote that he had fled to the mountains, but his conscience would not let him rest, and he wanted to tell where the remains of the matrices were hidden and to whom the sealing wax had been given. He described a house on the outskirts, a barn with a double bottom, and a crooked step at the entrance that only those who lived there would not trip over. The guards found the barn and the double bottom. At the bottom lay the remains of seals and pieces of soft metal. This closed one of the circles of the case. The letter, brought in winter, became the final point in the picture of spring days. Over the months, the slow fruits of the choices made then became visible. The locksmith was given the right to teach his craft to 3 street children in a workshop at the city gates. He said it was not charity, but a profitable business. The master needed hands, and the city needed people who knew how to reinforce doors. One of the boys turned out to be surprisingly precise, and within a year, he was already making spikes himself. This was yet another example of how hidden talent, when brought to the fore, restores strength to the city where there was once emptiness. Ruggiero sent a letter from Lucca. He wrote that everything was fine, that the fabric trade was going well, and that he remembered how two young men in Florence, with bells and books, did what any honest person should do. He asked to convey that if the city ever found itself in trouble again, he would come with people and money without asking who would pay. The letter was read by the town crier in the square between two announcements about the price of grain and the repair of the city wall. The people nodded. They heard in this not boasting, but quiet loyalty. One evening, a small group gathered at Marcella's house: Pietro, the senior scribe, and Armano's uncle, the locksmith. They ate simple soup and black bread. The conversation was not about fame, but about work. They discussed how many strokes the big bell would ring in times of danger, how best to arrange the tables for calculations so that spikes in activity would be visible, how to store the seals so that no one could replace the soft metal with hard metal. They argued, but calmly. Each had their own area of responsibility, and each understood that their common task was not to sing a single song, but to maintain a steady rhythm for the third year in a row. It was not spectacular, but it was the very order that made the city sustainable. In the spring, candles lit up under the dome of the cathedral again, but this time without daggers and alarm. The marble was clean. In the corner stood a bench that had been placed there so that people could look at the stone and remember that there had been a blow and a choice. Fabio, who had come from the roads, sometimes sat by the bench and ran his finger along the strings, playing quietly. His sound was no longer disturbing, but clear. He said he remembered how funny it was to live in a city where everyone thought he was a joker, and then one day he just did what needed to be done. The children listened and asked their elders why there was a plaque with dates hanging by the bench. They were answered in simple words. They were told that on that day, people did not become heroes. They just did their job and did not turn away. That was enough for the city to move on. At the end of this long road, Lauro bound the book of events, inserted another sheet into it, a table of marks that helped distinguish chance from design, and carefully tied the string. He did not feel important. He felt that a new way of life had taken root in the city. To look at the line, listen to the beat, not rush ahead without a purpose, but also not step aside when the time came to take a step. It seemed to him that now the words in his notebooks no longer argued with each other, but stood like stones in a masonry. They held up the roof so that families could live under it, argue about the price of fish, and teach children letters that would not become secret signs for anyone. It was a simple ending where emotional justice came not in the form of a loud miracle, but as the fruit of many calm decisions. And if someone ever asks what changed the course of those days, the book will record not the name of one person, but a chain of actions. A foreign merchant, a neat line in a table, a spike in a door, a knot in a rope, herbs on a table, letters from the road, and even a quiet request for mercy for a man who is in pain and who still bears guilt. This is how the city chooses itself again, without loud words, but with a clear reckoning. The bells rang warmly and evenly in those days, and this sound was not a heroic song, but the working rhythm of a place where life is more important than playing with daggers.